Hey there knitters, welcome to episode 61 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Today we're going to cover two topics that are partners in the world of garment design. The first, or I guess the second part of it, has to do with an actual write-in request. And the request was quite simple. How do you convert a bottom-up garment into a top-down garment? The other part of the conversation that I want to have before we even cover that is talking about why designers would knit top-down versus bottom-up versus a couple of other methods of construction that you might not think about on a regular basis. So let's start with what I think of as the four methods of construction for knitted garments. The obvious is going to be a top-down style garment. As it sounds, you start at the neckline edge and you increase shaping through the yoke, or not, but essentially you're working from the very top of the garment down to the bottom of the garment, and eventually sleeves will be joined to that. The second method of construction that would be the next common would be bottom up. Pretty much everything you're doing in top-down construction, you're doing in bottom-up construction without one important benefit that you get with top-down. You can't try the garment on as you go. With a top-down construction, if you have, say, a target yoke length that you need to knit to, you can put it on as you go. With bottom up, you don't really have that option because you're knitting the tube of the body first and then creating the upper half or the yoke of the garment. The next, I don't even want to say common. It's not common anymore, at least not in designs that I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years, is pieced construction. In this case, you're knitting the front and the back and the sleeves all separately. You might be working them top down or bottom up, but because they're in pieces, you're largely going to be knitting them flat. In some cases, you may knit the front and back separately, seam them, and then work the sleeves outwards from the garment in the round, but not in every case. And then the fourth type of construction, which we see very infrequently, but I always get excited when we do see it, would be a sideways construction. You start at one cuff, you knit the entirety of the sleeve, you knit across the body, and then you complete the second sleeve. So why does a designer choose a particular style of garment? By and large, I would say that in most cases, it has to do simply with the designer's preference. In some cases, it does, of course, have to do with silhouette, whether they want raglan seams or whether they want to include color work versus a really square, boxy silhouette. But for the most part, because you can tailor a lot of those different shapes to different silhouettes, a lot of the time it's just preference. It may be that they learned a particular way of constructing a garment, and so that's how they feel most comfortable. In other cases, though, it's less preference and more having control over particular elements of a design. So let's look at the four different types of construction that I just talked about and why you might or might not choose it to construct a particular garment. So let's start with the least common, because while I think I have some pretty good experience, I of course don't know everything about every designer and their design process, but let's just talk really briefly about side-to-side construction. It's not used very often, probably because it's not overly practical when it comes to trying it on, but when it comes to controlling a method of a design element, it's really useful. If you think about constructing a garment with cables on it, cables are worked vertically. So they come up a garment this way as we knit across it, right? We're creating our crisscrosses vertically up the garment. If you want to have horizontal cables across your garment, some portion or all of that garment is going to be worked vertically. So just like when we work from top to bottom and we're knitting across our garment, we create our cables vertically. So our cables are created perpendicular to the way we construct it. If we're working side to side construction, our rows are now going up and down across our body. So our cables run horizontally across the body. I'm sure there are other cases in which you would use horizontal construction for that, but cables is the one that comes to mind. So that's why we would use that type of construction. Let's talk a little bit about seamed garments. A great example of it would be the Oceansider sweater that I released. Actually, it's been more than a year now, in 2023. So this is a garter stitch garment that is knit in pieces and seamed. And so I know a lot of people would say, why would you do that? It's so much easier to knit in the round. There's a couple of reasons. The biggest one being that this garment is knit in garter stitch all over. Garter stitch worked flat simply means you're knitting on the right side and the wrong side. And as someone who definitely prefers knitting over purling, I would much rather knit all of my pieces flat so that I don't have any purl stitches than trying to work it instead of working it in the round, which would require me to knit one round and purl one round. It also negates the issue of the jog that you get at your beginning of round when you're working garter stitch in the round. Because knitting in the round is a coil, as opposed to when we knit flat, we have a starting and stopping point. Knitting in the round is a coil, so the end of your round sits a little bit higher than the beginning of your round, so the stitches jump. When you transition between knits and purl stitches at that beginning of round, you get a bit of a jog, that's the word we use, in your work. The bump that would have been on the previous row at the end of round is now being moved up to the end of the round on top of the beginning of the previous round. That's really hard to do visually with your fingers, but if you've ever knit garter stitch the round, you probably know what I'm talking about. And I really didn't want that up my garment. And the third of four reasons that I chose to knit it flat is it allows me to maintain my gauge across the entire project. If I knit the body flat and the sleeves flat, there's no gauge change that I have to worry about changing needle size to maintain my tension. And the last reason, and I promise this isn't necessarily me promoting this garment, just explaining why a designer might choose seamed versus not, is controlling the shape of the garment. Garter stitch is a very stretchy fabric vertically. It's wonderfully squishy and delightfully cozy to wear, but if you have it hanging, such as like the weight of a garment on your body, it can stretch vertically. By choosing to seam the pieces, it prevents that. You've given the sides of your garment, the shoulders of your garment, and the underarm, as well as the top armhole edge of your garment, structure just by seaming the pieces together rather than allowing them to hang without any kind of structure as you would if you'd worked it in the round. So that was my particular reason, but I would guess that in many cases when a designer chooses to work a garment seamed, one or more of those factors is going to come into play. Structure, consistency of gauge, ease of construction, and wearability. All right, now let's talk a little bit about construction of bottom-up sweaters with flat yokes. Flat yokes simply meaning that after you have completed the body and you get to the underarms, you separate the front and back half of the sweaters and work them flat, back and forth, as opposed to in the round anymore. So despite the fact that you cannot try it on as you go because you're working from the bottom up, there are some benefits to knitting this method. The first of them is simply that if that's the style of garment you want to make, it's probably the easiest approach. Can you work a flat yoked garment top down? Absolutely, and we'll come to that. But going from the bottom up, it's just a lot easier to work in the round up to a point and then work the smallest portion of the garment flat. You can also pick up and knit sleeves from the armholes that you create when you work the yoke and work outwards in the round. So you have the most amount of knitting done in the round that you can, with the smallest amount knit flat. I suppose I should back up and say that you can try the garment on as you go when you're working bottom up, but not until you've made quite a bit of progress in the yoke. And the reason you would want to try it on as you go is largely to make sure that the yoke depth fits you the way you'd like it to. If you are knitting the front and you decide that you think the yoke depth looks right, or you've reached the target yoke depth that the designer has provided, you can place those stitches on hold, work the back of the yoke, and you can always use locking markers to attach the two shoulders to mimic the seam that you will eventually create, and try it on. It's definitely more cumbersome than if you're working, say, a top-down garment, but it is feasible. So I guess I just wanted to make sure I didn't leave with a blank statement of you can't try it on. You can. It just takes a little bit more work. So the sort of cons that I see of working a bottom-up style garment with a flat yoke is, we've already discussed, you can't try it on, or it's more fussy to try it on as you go, but you're dealing with a 2-gauge situation. When you think about a top-down circular style garment, everything is worked in the round with the exception of perhaps a few short rows at the very top. And so you know that your gauge will be consistent throughout the yoke, the body, and for the most parts, the sleeves as well. We'll talk about that another time. But when you're dealing with a bottom-up yoked garment, or flat yoked garment, you're dealing with the gauge in the body in the round and the yoke gauge being worked flat. For some people, that's not an issue. Their row gauge and stitch gauge are close enough between the two fabrics as to not be noticeable. But some people have what we call rowing out, meaning that their stitch gauge may not change noticeably between working flat versus in the round, but their row gauge changes quite significantly because their tension when they work a knit row is very different from their tension when they work a purl row. So in the cases where you are someone that has a visible difference in your flat versus in the round, you may not like a flat yoked style garment as much because you get that difference in your gauge. The other thing to consider is if you're working bottom up flat yoke style garments and you're knitting the sleeves by picking the stitches up from the armhole edges, you're working your garment in this direction but your sleeves in this direction. So trying to have stitch patterns that match each other could be slightly more challenging. You might have to reverse something or simply omit it. It depends how structured you are in your stitch patterns. Okay, last but not least, bottom up constructed circular yoke style garments. This is going to start out very similarly to a bottom up flat yoke style garment, but you're going to construct each of the pieces a little bit differently. So your body will be worked exactly the same. However, you're going to be joining the sleeves to the body when you hit that underarm point so you can complete the yoke all in one piece. That's the circular nature of the construction of a circular yoke style garment. So the odds are pretty good that you have already knit your sleeves before you even get to the body. So you can not really try it on very easily until you get to the top of the yoke, because otherwise everything is going to be too wide and it will sit low on your shoulders and your chest. But it's nice because if you're working the body this way, you've also worked the sleeves the same direction. So you have a little bit more control about your stitch pattern looking the same or the most contiguous over the entire length of your garment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about top-down flat yoke construction. Why would you do it? I've already said that bottom up flat yoked is probably the easiest method of construction for a drop shoulder or set in style sleeve. you can work it top down. I think in some cases it can feel fussier when you're starting a garment. So when you work a circular yoke style garment, when you work a bottom up flat yoked garment, you simply work the body in the round, separate, work the yokes flat, and then seam the shoulders. That is it. Most people have no trouble with those techniques. When you need to work a flat yoke constructed style garment top down, you're going to be working the pieces separately, and it requires you to pick up and knit stitches from the shoulders. So more often than not, you'll construct it by working the back of the garment first, from the shoulders down to the underarm. Then you'll work each half of the yoke separately until you get to the bottom of your neckline. So you're going to be picking stitches up from that back shoulder edge and knitting forward. You're going to then join these and work down to the underarms. Once the front and back have both reached their target length at the underarm, then you begin working in the round. So it is simply reverse engineering, but it feels fussier. There's a lot of yarns being joined and broken and stitches being picked up and knit. It's not really any more complicated unless you are intimidated by picking up and knitting stitches. But I would say in most cases, it's pretty approachable. So why, if a designer can knit top down or bottom up flat yoked, why would they choose one over the other? I would guess, as I said earlier in the episode, some of it simply comes down to preference or the way that they learned how to construct a garment. But in some cases, you need control over your stitch pattern. And I wore this sweater today for a very particular reason. When I first designed this sweater back in 2018, I designed it as a set-in sleeve style garment worked from the bottom up. Now I have constructed it as a top down, and they look very similar. However, the trouble that I ran into is that because it's such a large stitch motif, and because I have to grade it for 13 different sizes of bodies, maintaining the difference between the top of the motif and the bottom of the neckline is really challenging when you're working bottom up. So it had to become a top-down constructed garment to make sure that the sizes fit all bodies equitably. There we go, equitably. So again, this isn't about my design decisions necessarily, but just the overall concept that when a designer chooses one over the other, it largely has to do with how the garment needs to be constructed so that it fits bodies equitably. Okay, so now that we've gone through the whys and a little bit about the hows, understanding that I have not covered absolutely every reason out there, if you have reasons why you think one or the other is done, please leave it in the comments. We're here to share information. I'm not trying to intentionally leave anything out or overlook anything. I just talk about it from my experiences because I'm me. Okay, so let's get to the second part of this episode where I am responding to an actual request of someone asking me to provide information on how to reverse engineer a bottom-up style garment into a top-down style garment. Now, the person who wrote in did not say whether they wanted this to be a circular yoke or a flat yoke style. I have made perhaps an unfair assumption that they wanted it to be circular yoke. I think because those are the ones that are most common. I will cover circular yoke today. If there are people who are looking for information about how to convert a bottom-up flat yoke, so for a drop shoulder or a set-in sleeve style, send me a message or leave a comment below and we can look at making that as a future episode. But let's just dive into the construction of a bottom-up circular yoke and how to convert that into a top-down circular yoke so that you have the fewest hiccups. So while every designer is going to approach this slightly differently, I will make some assumptions about how a bottom-up garment is designed by most designers. I've seen it two ways, but I'm going to talk about the one that I see most commonly. So with a bottom-up circular yoke style garment, you generally work the sleeves first. You can work them after you've completed the body, but I think most people like to get them out of the way because you don't have to worry about sitting on sleeve island. So you'll work each sleeve from the very bottom, the cuff, up to your target sleeve length. This target sleeve length is going to be the length where you want the sleeve to hit from your wrist or above to your underarm. The most important length being that of your underarm because it will be eventually joined to the body. Once you've completed each sleeve, you're going to put your live stitches on hold and break the yarn. You'll likely have to place 2 sets of stitches on hold at the top of each sleeve. You're going to put a small number of stitches for your underarm on hold, and these will be placed on hold separately from the majority of the upper arm stitches. You may see something like your upper arm stitch circumference is 60 stitches. You may put 8 stitches on hold for the underarm and the remaining 52 on hold for the sleeve. You're still putting all 60 stitches on hold. They'll just likely be on 2 separate holders, whether it's spare needles, waste yarn, anything to just hold your stitches so that when it comes time to join the sleeves back to the body, you're only picking up the stitches that you need for the top of the sleeve. You're not dealing with any stitches for the underarm. So once the sleeves are complete, you're going to, as I mentioned, break the yarn, and now you're going to start the body. You're going to work from the cast on edge, which will be the bottom of the hem, and work all the way up to the underarm. There's may or may not be waist shaping in it, but you'll be casting this on separately from the sleeves and working it up to the underarm. Once both sleeves and the body are complete, it's time to join the sleeves to the body and shape the yoke from the underarm all the way up to the neckline. Some stitches from the body are going to be placed on hold just like you did for the sleeves. So if you placed 8 sleeve stitches on hold for the underarm, you'll be placing 8 body stitches on hold for the underarm as well. And finally, once your yoke shaping is complete, the sleeves are integrated into the garment, your last step is simply going to be working the collar. The collar can be contiguous, meaning there's no break between the stitches and the top of the yoke and your collar, or not contiguous. If you have any more questions about collar styles, check out episode 60. I give you 3 different styles that you can use interchangeably without changing stitch counts that will give you different levels of structure to your collar. Let's take a look at reverse engineering the steps that you're going to work to make sure that you seamlessly convert the garment from bottom up into top down construction. So when it comes to starting a circular yoke style garment top down, you've got a couple of options as to where you begin. You can start at the very top of your collar so that the top edge is your cast on edge and work contiguously throughout the yoke, or you can cast on at the bottom of your collar and work through the yoke and eventually come back and pick up the stitches for your collar. Either way, your construction will start pretty similarly. You're going to cast on the number of stitches for the top of your yoke that is the same number of stitches that you decreased down to in a bottom-up construction. So if you're looking at the bottom-up construction instructions, you're going to look for the smallest number of stitches that you decreased down to for the top of your yoke and work everything in the opposite direction. So if your yoke in a bottom-up construction for your size ends with 80 stitches before the collar, you're going to cast on 80 stitches and either work the collar or begin the yoke. As I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, for collar options, check out episode 60 of this podcast, which I will link below as well, just to get a better understanding of what your collar options are. So now I think the fun part begins. Once the collar is out of the way, you're going to start moving into working the shaping of your yoke. What you're doing, in essence, is inverting everything that you did on the decrease for a bottom up into increases for the top down. Your stitch counts will increase instead of decrease, but should increase at the same interval. So anywhere you saw a knit two together or an SSK, you'll work a make one left or a make one right, or a right lifted or left lifted increase, or even a yarn over if you want to keep it really simple. You're simply going to convert your decreases into increases. There's two important things to note there. The first is that if your decreases in the bottom up construction method are side by side, there are no stitches between them, you will need to adapt your top down construction to have a stitch between them. You can't work a make one left and a make one right immediately beside each other. You need a stitch between them. So just be aware that when you're converting from bottom up to top down, that you need that one stitch buffer to allow your increases to work. The second thing to consider is when you're working your increases, your target count before you separate your sleeves should be the number of stitches that you have on your needles after you join the sleeves to the body in the bottom up construction method. So just make sure, and you can write it down on a separate piece of paper, make sure you've got your target stitch counts all the way throughout the yoke. You want the stitches at the top to be the same, and the stitches when it's time to separate your sleeves at the bottom of the yoke to be the same. That way you know your shaping is going to be the same as if you'd worked it bottom up. The other caveat I just want to address when you do this, and you've probably already thought about this if you're considering converting the construction of a garment, is the directionality of your stitch pattern. Make sure that it's a motif that easily inverts, or that you don't mind if it inverts the opposite direction if it's worked top down instead of bottom up. So once you've achieved all of the target stitch counts for your yoke, you're going to need to separate the stitches for your sleeves out from your body. Because we worked the yoke shaping to encompass the whole yoke, which includes the shaping of our upper arms up to our underarm, all of those stitches need to be taken out of the body so that we can knit the body to the target circumference here. When you separate the stitches for those sleeves out of your body, you're going to need to cast on stitches that mimic the stitches you put on hold previously for your sleeves. So to use an example that we used when we were talking about the bottom up construction, let's say our target sleeve count is 60 stitches. The underarm stitches that we placed on hold was 8. And these are two critical numbers. So when we separate out our sleeve stitches, the number that we'll take out for each sleeve will be 52. Because we have not yet created the 8 stitches for the underarm, we're going to cast them on. So if your target is 60 and we know we're going to have 8 underarm stitches, we'll put the 52 on hold for each sleeve. And then at the place where you took those stitches out, you'll cast on the 8 stitches. So you just want to make sure that the number of stitches that you put on hold at the underarm when you were working bottom up is the same number of stitches you cast on when you're working bottom or top down. You just want to make sure that your total body stitches include those 8 stitches at each underarm so the circumference is correct. It probably goes without saying now that once you've separated your sleeves and cast on those 8 stitches for each underarm, or whatever the number is for your pattern, not necessarily 8, you're simply going to finish the garment body with or without your shaping, bind off at the bottom of the hem, and you're largely done the body. Well, I guess you are done the body of the sweater. So once the body is complete, there are 1 or maybe 2 steps left. The first step is going to be putting the sleeves onto the body of your sweater. Unlike when you worked the sleeves for a bottom up where you knit them completely separately and then joined them into the yoke, To work top down, you're going to be placing the stitches of each sleeve that you had on hold back onto your working needle, picking up and knitting into the stitches that you cast onto the body to complete your sleeve. So to use our example one more time, if we've got 52 live sleeve stitches on hold, we'll place those on our working needle. Then we're going to join our working yarn and pick up the remaining 8 stitches to complete our 60 stitch circumference from the stitches that we cast onto the body. The nice part about doing top down is it's completely seamless. Because you're picking up and knitting into 8 stitches that already exist, you don't have to go back and seam them. Now, for the sleeve construction, because we're working the opposite way that it was originally created, we're going to be decreasing our stitches down to the cuff circumference rather than increasing up from the cuff to the underarm circumference. So just like in the yoke of the body, anywhere you see an increase instruction, you will work it as a decrease so that your stitch count continues to go down the length of the sleeve. Sixth and final step, if you didn't do it at the beginning of the garment, is simply to go back and finish the collar. If you cast on at what would be the bottom of your collar or the top of the yoke, you'll have to go back, pick up and knit the stitches for your collar and work them upwards. So there we go. That's a breakdown of how to convert your bottom up style circular garment into a top down circular garment. If you've got any questions about anything I covered here, let me know. And again, if you're interested in seeing information about converting a flat yoke style garment like a drop shoulder or a set in sleeve, just let me know and we'll add it to the list for future videos. So before I sign off for the day, I just want to remind those of you who have not yet signed up that we have got our Valentine's Day Knitting Intensive coming up in just 2.5 weeks. On Friday, February 14th of this year, 2025, I'm going to be joining my best friend Heather Walpole of UU Yarns for a 3 breakout session knitting intensive that's talking all about knitting. We're going to be talking about gauge, ease, how to modify the sizes of things using that information. We're going to be talking about color substitutions and color theory for those of us who struggle to make color change substitutions. I know I'm one of them. And then we're also going to be talking about best practices for chart reading, slipping stitches, and working through patterns that have multiple sizes in them. So it's going to be a really fun session. We will be done, even for those on the East Coast in the US, by late afternoon, so that if you have any plans that evening, you can still go out and enjoy them uninterrupted. But we hope you'll join us. I have a video in my link of videos. It's got a bright pink cover page, so it's pretty easy to find. So you can learn more about the course. It's only a $14 investment to spend the day with us, and I think it's just going to be a whole heap of fun because it's knitting. Yay! All right, my friends, I will see you again in a couple of weeks. As always, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Have a wonderful rest of your week and happy knitting.